Living in London, it's very easy to get lost in the busyness. It's a world of non-stop motion, work, and dream chasing. For this reason, it's important to slow down and find your way to reflect. For me, this is within landscape photography. By using a tripod, you're forced to think, to consider, to focus. In the city, we have a different landscape to photograph, but it's no less beautiful. It's just different. As for this composition, the soft sky and flowing water frame our man-made haven. The horizontal and vertical lines of the structures are imposing, yet assert themselves as the dominant subject of the scene. We have movement in the natural parts of the frame, and a stoic stillness in the city. It is this juxtaposition that really enables the composition to be engaging and interesting. I've set up early and intend to shoot from before sunset through blue hour, so I give myself the opportunity to capture the best moment in that span of time. Some days sunset will produce the best dramatic light, other days blue hour will create the best mood. In the case of cityscape photography, I tend to prefer blue hour, as this time offers a wonderful colour balance between the building lights and the colour in the sky. When photographing on a tripod, we have the flexibility to capture a range of exposures that we may need to use to create the final perfect image. I like to shoot in 5 photo brackets, with a one-stop exposure difference between each image. This means that we can potentially take the shadow areas from an overexposed image, and the brightest highlights from an underexposed image, then blend them with the accurate exposure to create an image with a higher dynamic range. As for our camera settings, we're going to use our camera's lowest native ISO. For me that's 100, and this means we'll have as little noise as possible in our final image. Next we'll use an aperture of 8, as this is the sharpest aperture for my lens. Usually, most lenses have their sharpest point between f8 and f11. Our shutter speed is then used just to set our exposure, and because we're on a tripod, it can be as long as we need it to be. As you continue to shoot through the evening, you'll only need to adjust your shutter speed to account for it getting darker. When it comes to focus, I would suggest using single point. This will give you the most control over getting an accurate autofocus. Due to how DSLR cameras work, you want to look for areas of high contrast on the same plane as your subject. Here it makes sense to focus on the top of one of the high-rise buildings, where there is a clear difference between highlight and shadow. Once you've got an accurate, pin-sharp focus, switch your camera to manual focus. This will make sure that when you're bracketing your shots, the focus doesn't change. You'll want to photograph throughout blue hour, as it can be hard to tell which set of photographs will be the best. You'll know that blue hour is over when the sky blackens, the contrast heightens, and the sky begins to take on colours of the city. These are usually oranges or pinks, and it's at this point that I usually pack up, as I'm really looking for the blue in the sky rather than the dark harshness of nighttime. Okay, so we're back home, we've got our images imported into Lightroom, and we're ready to begin our editing. Now, before we start working on it, I would just say that the Lightroom section of this video is really just to prepare your files for Photoshop. So we're going to try and give you the largest amount of range, the easiest blend you can possibly get by following these general rules that I'm going to show you, so that when you get into Photoshop it all just comes together much more easily, really. Because even if you were to create quite hard files to work with, if you're good enough with Photoshop you could blend them. It would just take you substantially more time. So we're going to try and make this as easy for you as possible. So the first thing you need to do is choose your 5 exposures you're going to work with. So for me, I've picked these 5. If your camera didn't move at any point in the process, you could pick images from different brackets. However, it's always going to be easier to pick the ones from the bracket that they're contained in. So this is one bracket. So I've got 0 exposure, -1, +1, -2, and +2. There we go. So that's what we're going to be working with. So what I recommend you do is select them like this, and then we're going to edit one image, and then we're going to sync the edit to the other images so that everything is sort of maintained across all of them, so that when they come to being placed on top of each other in Photoshop, we're not going to have any problems. So your basic box is the first thing we're going to cover. First, I would always do exposure first in any edit, because that changes the way that everything else looks in this panel. So do exposure first. So for me, it's about a stop, maybe even slightly more than a stop underexposed, but I'm going to go for about a stop because I know I'm going to take elements from other pictures anyway. So I'm going to go for about a stop increase for me. Again, set it for what your image looks like. This is particularly happened because the scene is backlit, so the sun is setting behind the scene, so my foreground is really dark, so my camera's meter wasn't quite accurate, but that's fine. I'll know that for the future and I'll need to adjust. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is our whites and blacks. I always like to do these next. Or you can do white balance here, it doesn't matter too much. Either of those two I would do next. So whites I'm just going to reduce slightly, and blacks I'm probably going to pull up slightly. Oh, there's not too many actually. In which case blacks I think are okay as they are. Next we can do white balance. So for me this is like slightly cold and a little bit green. Again, you're going to have to judge it off of your image. So I'm just going to go to, let's go to 5600, feels slightly better, and then let's go to +11 tint, and we'll get rid of that green that we've got. There we go, that's looking a bit better. Next we're going to do highlights and shadows. Now these are probably the most important actually out of these outside of exposure. So we're just going to drop our highlights slightly, so I'm going to go to -35, -30, something like that, just to pull these back, so your right hand side of your histogram is being pulled back towards the center, again reducing contrast. And then shadows I'm going to bring right up, so I'm going to go to about 70 shadows, and that's, you can see it's just drawing out more information in our foreground, and it's reduced some of the brightest parts in the highlights. This is a good place to start from. I'm not going to add any clarity because that's going to add some strange effects in the water. And dehaze you can play with using if you want to. If you want to add color in at this point, you can do, but it's going to add some contrast back in, which I don't really want to mess with too much. Now, the other thing you can do here is you could take even more contrast out if you wanted to, but I'm not going to do that because we're going to be using a blending method in Photoshop anyway, so we should be absolutely fine. So that's where I'm going to leave my basic box. Then I'm going to come down to detail. We're going to add some sharpening. I usually add about 90 when I'm blending and know that I'm going to be sharpening in Photoshop anyway. So if I wasn't adding another layer of sharpening, I go to about 110. I'm on a 46 megapixel sensor, so I can get away with more sharpening. If you're on something less, then I would recommend using less sharpening. It's all relative to the megapixel count of your sensor. Then we're always going to mask it. We always mask our sharpening. So holding the Alt key, we're going to click and drag this up until we're making sure we're just sharpening the bits of the image that we want to have sharpened. So I'm going to do about there. The sky is not being sharpened at all, and only bits of the water are being sharpened. Even going up to 70 is probably good, then less of the water is sharpened. No noise reduction because we were shooting 100 ISO, and we want to enable profile corrections so that we're popping out the barrel distortion or any vignetting that your lens caused. In this case, it looks like it didn't quietly correct for the vignette, so I'm just going to add a little bit more highlight manually around the edge just to bring the vignette. I mean, you can still even see it that this top corner is quite a lot darker than like here, which is the same sort of point in the sky. So that's your vignette, so you can keep adding until you're happy that the vignette has been sort of neutralized. So I'm just going to do that. That looks absolutely fine. Now, the most important thing here outside of the basic box is your transform tool. So what you can do is try using auto and full would be the two I'd recommend. Full, you can see, is corrected the perspective and the verticals. Auto is just correcting the verticals. But I'm going to quickly show you the manual way because that's always good to know. So often the auto or full will work, but if it doesn't, then you just need to come here and select this tool, which is the upright tool, and find the edge of a straight line. So if in this case I've got the edge of this building, And clicking and holding, you're going to select 2 points on the building like that. And then we're going to do the same on the other side of the image. So that's a click and hold, drag down, try and draw a straight line along the edge of the building like that. And then you'll see that it uses those 2 points to calculate the verticals. So because you've drawn those lines and you've told it that those should be vertical in your image, it's corrected for those lines. So we can hit done. There we go. So that is the basis of our edit done. We just need to sync it across all 5 files. So with them all selected, on the image that we've edited, press the sync button. In here, making sure that everything is ticked that you've adjusted. So white balance, all of your basic tone, dehaze was used, sharpening. We didn't do any color because we're going to do that in Photoshop. Noise reduction, again, if it hasn't had anything applied, it doesn't matter if it's ticked. Transform, you want to apply that because you want to make sure that all the adjustments are the same so that the straight lines are made straight in all of them. And lens corrections, again, needs to be applied as well. So let's hit synchronize and have a quick look through our images. So this is our -1 now, which still looks good. We've got our +1, it's good, especially for the foreground is nice. -2, it's good. We're going to be using this one for the badges. And then our +2 we may use for the foreground, but it may end up being too bright. So we'll play it by ear and we'll see how that goes. So there we go. So our 5, we just need to export them now. So I'm going to right click, export, export, and then choose where I'm going to save them. So it's a project I was working on. Let's put it into Cityscape, Canary Wharf, and then JPEGs for PSD is what I'm calling them. So save them in that folder. And then quality is going to be 100, Adobe RGB, JPEG. It's going to be 300 PPI, so that if we want to print this image, we can. No resizing, you don't want to resize the images, because again, it's going to make them smaller. No sharpening, no additional sharpening, and then I'm going to do show in Explorer. So you can do show in Finder on a Mac, show in Explorer, rather than open in Photoshop, and I'm going to show you why. So hit export, and when that's done, you just need to open up Photoshop, and I'll see you in there. Okay, so now we're in Photoshop. You need to come up to File, Script, Load Files into Stack, and then in here you just need to go to Browse, select the images you just exported, hit OK. It's worth clicking Attempt to automatically align source images, and it's just going to stack them all so that there's no movement between each of the images. So for example, if your tripod moved ever so slightly, even just by a single pixel, this will correct it for you. Just hit OK, and this will load them all into a stack in Photoshop. You'll see them all appear as layers here on the right hand side. Okay, once that's done, the first thing I suggest you do is move your 0 exposure, so your middle exposure, to the bottom. You get your other 4 if you select them with Shift. So click 1, hold Shift and click the top one. And then press Command or Control G, and it will group them for you. I then like to name this, so let's call this Adjustments. Then in here I like to name these as well. So this is our +2 exposure. This is our -2 exposure. This is our +1 exposure. And this is our -1 exposure. And there we go. So I like to turn these ones off because it's good to be looking at your base. The base is where you should be building from. So this is the one I like to show. You can also name this one base or 0 if you want to. But yeah, that's where I start from. Okay, now we need to create our first luminosity mask. To do that, we come up here to Channels. We hold Command on a Mac or Control on a PC and click on the thumbnail little image next to RGB here. You click that, you'll get marching ants all over it. Now this is your first selection. So to save that now, we have to come down here to Save Selection as Channel. When we click that, our selection comes up here as Alpha 1. If you go to Alpha 1, you can see, if I just deselect that selection, you can now see. Now essentially this is a mask. Everything that white is being selected and everything that's black is not. And greys, the level of the density of the grey, so the closer to black it is, the less of that tone is being selected. And the closer to white it is, the more of that tone is being selected. So you can see if I zoom in, here in this strip, and for example in the HSBC sign at the top of this tower here, it's completely white, and that tells you that that's the brightest part of your image. And down here in the dock, right at the bottom where there's almost no detail, is black, so that's where there's no highlights in that part of the image. Now, so this is a good start. We've got our highlights here, but for it to be usable, I would suggest you define it further. So at the moment it's quite general, it's selecting anything that's vaguely bright in our picture essentially. So to make this more precise, you need to make sure that it's selected. So that's Command or Control and then clicking on the Alpha 1 layer. And now you need to hold Control, Shift and Alt on a PC, or Command, Shift and Alt on a Mac. And again, click on the thumbnail of the picture. Click a couple of times and you'll see that your selection gets more and more defined. So for me, clicking twice looks like it's now selecting the areas of the image more specifically that I'd like it to. So now we've done that, we can save that again as a channel. So coming down here to save selection as channel. And now our Alpha 2, if I deselect that, you can see is a far more defined selection than our first one. All the whites in here are clearly bright white, and then everything we're not selecting is pretty much black. There's bits of the sky, there's bits of the water, but largely it's just the highlights in the image, which is exactly what we want. So now we're going to use this mask we've just made and apply it to one of our layers. So to do that, we need to make sure that it's selected. So that's either Command or Control click on our Alpha 2 layer we've made. We go back to our layers. For me, I'm going to go to my -1, click on my -1, and I'm going to apply the layer. I'm going to add a layer mask to this layer, and it will apply that selection to this layer. It all goes funky red, but if you just click once on the layer, it will disappear for you. Now, if I turn that off and on, so that's with it off, and that's with it on, you can see it's brought back all that detail in this image, in specifically the areas that we told it to bring that detail in. So it's taken the highlights from our -1 layer, so our darker layer that we captured in our bracket, and brought them through and placed them on top of our base layer. So this is with just our base layer, and this is with just the lights being taken out of our -1. There we go, and you can see that we've got more color in those areas of the picture. So that's the first step to doing this. Our next thing we can do is create a shadow mask. So to do that, we're going to go back to our channels. We're going to select our Alpha 1 again, because that's the first highlight mask we made. Got that selected. We're going to come up here to select inverse, and it's now, if I save this as a channel, so we've made the inverse, save as channel, our Alpha 3 now is a shadow selection. So you can see now that everything that is white is classed as shadow, and everything that's black is highlight. So you can see at the top of the Canary Wharf tower, it has not selected it, but it's selected lots of the rest of the image, and that's just because lots of the image is quite dark. Now we need to do exactly the same as we did with our highlights layer. We need to make it more precise. So again, we're going to go to Command or Control, Shift and Alt. And with this, you get a little X appearing by your mouse. We're going to click, I've clicked twice, I'm going to click 3 times, and I'm going to see what that looks like. So I clicked 3 times, I've made it 3 times more precise. I'm going to come here and save this as a channel, and let's have a look at what this looks like. So there we go, compared to our Alpha 3, this is far, far more precise than it was. Now you can play around with how precise or not precise you'd like this to be you can always just come back to your Alpha 3 one, the one you started with, selecting it, doing the same process, Command or Control, Shift and Alt, and then clicking it maybe once, because maybe it only needs to be defined by 1 stage, or it may need to be defined by 5. It's just something you can trial and error on an image by image basis, but for this one, it's looking like 3 clicks for me did do a good job. So I'm now going to select my shadow selection. So it's the same as we had before, Control or Command, and then clicking on the thumbnail. We come back to our layers, and in this case, I'm going to apply this to my +1. So I'm going to make a layer mask here on my +1, and you can see it's now applied it. We've got the fun red again. So there we go, that's applied that to it. So if I turn it off and on, you can see the effect is quite heavy. Now what you can do, now we've done this, is go to our layer mask, and using the brush tool, if you press B to go to our brush tool, and we paint in black, so the effect is not affecting that area. We It's quite a low flow. I'm just going to use 10% flow so that the effect isn't pasted on, as it were. I'm just going to paste some of it out of the buildings in the background so that the shadow is not being brought up as much in the background. Now, something you could do, a different way of dealing with this, if you think it's been brought up slightly too much, is to lower the opacity if the whole thing needs to be brought down. Or if just an area you want to change, you can go back into your channels and define it further. That would also work. I'm just going to show you another method by just painting some of the shadows back in. I like the shadows in the foreground, but I don't like the shadows in the background. So there we go. I've painted that out. Let's see what that looks like. So you can see it's nicely lifted some of the areas. I'm just going to paint a little bit more out in here because it just feels slightly too heavy. There we go. It means the effect is not being applied there as heavily. Always turning your layers off and on so you can see your handiwork as you go. Can be very, very useful way of seeing what you're actually doing to your picture. So there we go. That looks absolutely fine. If you want to be a bit more precise, you can zoom in and use a smaller brush, but for the sake of showing you, I'm just going to show you quite quickly. Now I'll show you very quickly if you wanted to, if I grab our Alpha 4 again, so this is the defined shadow one. If we were to make this more precise, so I'm going to select this with Command or Control and then Alt and Shift. And I'm going to define it even further, so even 2 more clicks. Let's make this one a selection. Now you can see it's basically just selected our foreground. I'm going to select this one and I'm going to apply this to our +2 just to see what it looks like. It might not work, but we can see what it does look like. Let's click Add Layer Mask, turn off that, and it's lifted our foreground even further, which I quite like actually. So, but I do not like it on the areas above it. So actually with a slightly higher flow, just go up to 50. I'm going to reduce the opacity of that at the top of the image, but I'm going to leave it at the bottom in that foreground element. Just because I like how it's lifting that detail. It's quite nice. There we go. Let's see what that looks like. That's quite nice. It's quite nice that it's adding this extra effect to the water. And I'm actually just going to reduce the opacity on that down to like 60% because I don't want the effect to be quite as heavy as it was. Just like another subtle little lift. So there we go. So that's our, at the moment, this is our before and our after. You can see it's brought lots more detail back into our scene. Okay, now to just use our -2. So in this image, we only really want to use the -2 for the brightest badges, so like the logos in this. You can see that even at -2, the HSBC is not wonderfully defined, but it's still significantly better here than it is in our base image. And I also quite like that there's a lot more detail in the Canary Wharf Tower at the top, for example. So we're going to see if we can bring that back. So in order to do that, we're going to go back to our channels. We're going to select our Alpha 2, which was our highlights layer. I'm going to select that with Command or Control click. And we're going to define this one a little bit further. So that's Control or Command, Shift and Alt. Click that a couple more times. Let's see what that one looks like. Have a look at our new Alpha 6. Yep, that's looking pretty good. It's obviously selecting lots of other lights, but it's really these defined areas that we're looking at because we're going to remove it from the rest of the image. Now if we come here to Alpha 6, make sure it's selected, go back to our layer, apply a layer mask to our -2, and you'll see it's applied that over the top now. Now with this layer mask, you can see the effect, because it's being layered over the top of our -2, I am going to just apply this effect slightly more heavily by using my brush, painting white over these signs. We're going to go and refine it a bit further than we have so far. Let me just paint this in. Be quite careful to not go over edges, would be my suggestion here. Like this. We're just making sure we're just affecting the areas with this mask that we want to affect. Looks good. City doesn't actually look that bad to start with, because it was a slightly darker sign, but State Street you can see can be brought out far more clearly. Right, and now we've done that, I'm just going to switch myself back to a black brush. So you can press X to switch yourself back, or press this button here on the left and it will switch them for you. And I'm just going to paint out the bleed of it so that it blends in slightly nicer. Make my brush a bit smaller. I'm going to draw myself in here. There we go. Where are we going? Up here to Barclays sign. Just draw some of the highlight back in because it looks slightly dark. It looks a bit odd. So we're just going to remove some of this shadow that was brought back in with that brush we just did. Something like this looks good. And then we've just got the HSBC sign. Remember, you can make your brush bigger and smaller with your square bracket keys. So the right hand square bracket key makes it bigger and the left hand makes it smaller. So it can be a quicker way to work when you're in Photoshop. Okay, cool. So that's all we're using the -2 for. You can see it's brought lots more detail back into those areas of the picture. Great. So the last thing we've got left to do here now is a mid-tone mask and then some sharpening. So to make our mid-tone mask, we're going to select our first highlight mask, which was this one, our Alpha 1. We're going to press Control or Command A, and it will select our whole image. Then pressing Control or Command and Alt, we're going to click on our highlights thumbnail, and that's going to subtract the highlights from that selection. And then we're going to hold Control or Command Alt and click on Alpha 3, which was our shadows, our first shadows selection. And if you've done it correctly, you'll get this message. And don't worry about it, just hit OK. If you come back over to your layers, it's worth clicking on your top one and then creating a curves layer. The mask will have been applied to the curves layer, and you can now add selective adjustments to just your midtones. You'll see if I push this right up, your brightest highlights are protected and your shadows are protected, and it's really only just adjusting your midtones. It's doing everything very evenly, which is a really, really nice way of adding contrast. So in this situation, I like to make a nice S-curve to add some contrast in. So that's pulling down our shadows and pushing up our highlights, something like that. You can turn the effect off and on and see what it's doing. Maybe a slightly stronger effect is quite nice for this picture. Something like this. It's really drawing all the color out and adding lots more detail and texture into the picture. And there you go. That is the end of using the luminosity masks for this image. The last thing we've got to do is sharpen. So to do that, we're going to press Control or Command, Alt, Shift and E, and that will make us a clone stamp layer. So this layer 1 is a clone stamp layer. It's a copy of everything below. It's important you do this because if you apply sharpening just the curves, it's only going to sharpen the adjustment layer, which means you won't actually see any sharpening occur. So you have to do it to a layer 1. Now on your layer 1, you come here to Filter, Other, High Pass. You set your radius. The lower the radius you use, depending on if you've added sharpening in Lightroom, and the megapixel of your camera. So for me, it's an image by image basis, but for me, I like to add somewhere between about 1.5 and 3.5, depending on the image. In this case, because I've already sharpened in Photoshop, we're going to use slightly less. So I'm going to start at, say, 2. My effect is slightly heavy. I can always reduce it with opacity. I'm going to hit OK. You get this lovely gray effect. If you come here to normal, whereas this is your blend mode, if you come to normal above your layers on the right, change this to overlay, it will now apply the sharpening as an overlay over the top of the rest of it. So this is without our sharpening, and this is with our sharpening. Now for me, it's slightly heavy, so I'm just going to reduce the effect. Let's go to our opacity and drop it to 70%. It's slightly lower. Let's go to 50% of an effect. But you can adjust on the fly by using your opacity. So there we go. That looks like a good level of sharpening. And there we have it. So you can obviously do more with this image. You can do more with your adjustment layers, play with color with the color balance tool, add some more vibrance. So for example, if we want to add a bit more color into this, you could add some more vibrance to it. I'd ease on the side of saturation, as I've talked about before. That it's a lot more heavy-handed than vibrant, so I'd use your vibrance slider. For example, there's other things you can do with this, but the luminosity masks are the most important part of this tutorial. So I hope this was useful for you. Please do leave any comments below if you need any help with anything, and I will see you next time.